All right, my friends, hopefully you had some success on this exercise. If you ran into any problems, don't sweat it. This really was a pretty challenging little exercise. So let's go through a solution right now together. Okay, so I'm inside of my counterscreen.js file. Again, that's inside of my screens directory. Inside of here, we're going to go through a identical refactor to what we did inside of Square Screen. So I'm going to first go through here and remove every reference to useState that I can find. So inside of my component, I've got the declaration of useState right here where we initially call it. I'm going to delete that. I'm then going to go into my first button element. We had a call to setCounter. SetCounter doesn't exist anymore, so I'm going to delete everything inside of that onPress. Same thing with the second onPress. And then finally, down inside this text element, I'm going to delete counter inside of those red brackets like so. All right, so now we can start to add some code in. First off, I'll go up to my import statement. I'll change the useState to useReducer. Then inside my component, I'm going to say const. Remember, we're going to destructure these two values that come back when we call useReducer. The first one is going to be our state object. The second one is going to be dispatch. Remember, a better name for dispatch would be like call my reducer, but usually by convention, once again, we call it dispatch. Then on the other side, we will call useReducer. I'm going to pass in a reducer. I don't have one defined inside of here just yet, but we're going to write that out in just a moment. So I'm going to write reducer nonetheless, even though it's not yet defined. And then remember, as a second argument, we're going to pass in some initial state object. So right away, we have to make a decision about what kind of object we're going to have to hold our state. In other words, what different properties will it have? Now, one thing I want to mention is that when we make use of useReducer, we don't technically have to store our state inside of an object. We could instead store our state inside of an array. Or we could just be a plain value, like a number that starts off as 0, or even a string. But usually, if you are in a situation where you need to make use of useReducer, generally, you're going to want to use an object. Because remember, if we're reaching for useReducer, that means that there are multiple different properties that we want to keep track of. So again, generally, we fall back to using an object for our state object with useReducer. Okay, so I'm going to put an object in here, and now we need to decide what properties it's going to have. I think that having a property of like count or counter, maybe just count, would make a lot of sense. And I'll give it an initial starting value of 0. Now remember, this initial object right here, or even our entire state object in general, you and I need to decide what that thing is going to have, or what different properties it will have. So if you decided to use a different property name right here of like counter, or current count, or present count, or whatever else, totally fine. You do not have to use the same property names as I. You just have to stay consistent inside this entire file. So I'm going to use count because, again, I think that makes a little bit of sense. All right, so now we can define our reducer function. I'm going to define that right above my component. So we'll say const reducer. And remember, this thing is going to be called with our current state object and our action. Remember, action, a better name for that would be like how to change state. Action is pretty darn unclear in my opinion. So if you want to call it something else just as a reminder to you, totally fine. But technically, by community convention, once again, we call it action. Okay, so inside of here, before we actually put our switch statement down, let's add a couple comments to just clarify exactly what we expect state and action to be. So first off, I expect state to be an object, very similar to the one we had down here that we passed in as our initial state. So it's going to have a count property, and that's going to be a number. Then as my second argument for action, once again, we're going to follow community convention here. So I'm going to expect this thing has a type property that's a string that describes the change that we need to make to our state object. So I will assume that maybe we will have an action with a type property of increment or decrement. If you use different type properties, or if you used a different property altogether to decide how to change your state object, totally fine as well. These different type properties and the different values assigned don't really make a difference at the end of the day. All that matters is that if you call a reducer, you just have to return the appropriately changed state object. That's all. Now, the second thing we might want to think about is whether or not this object needs a payload property. In this case, our counter is only ever adjusting our current value by 1. So it's only ever going to go up by 1 or down by 1. So technically, we don't really need a payload this time around to describe whether or not we are increasing our counter by like 1 or -1. So if you left off the payload property, that's fine. But if you put it on, that's fine as well. Technically, if you add in the payload property right here, you are no longer constrained to updating your count by 1 every time, because you could have a payload of like 15, and now you could increase your counter by like 15 at a time. So if you decided to add in that property, totally fine. And if you left it off, that's fine as well. I'm going to add in the payload property here because that's what I showed on our square screen example back over here. So I'm going to kind of assume that you probably added in a payload as well. Okay, so now we can do our switch statement. We're going to switch over action.type. There are two possible cases, the case where it's equal to increment and the case where it's equal to decrement, and of course the default case. Remember, the default case is just here in case we accidentally call a reducer with an unknown action type. Not really likely in this case, but nonetheless, we throw it in every time anyways. So in the default case, we'll take care of that right away. I don't want to make any change to my state object if we hit the default case, so I'll just return state. So now we can handle case increment. So inside of here, we're going to end up with some syntax very similar to what we saw back inside of square screen. So I'm going to return a new object, because remember, we do not modify our state object here. So we're going to return a new object. We're going to take all the current values out of the state object and throw it into the new one. And then we're going to make a change to our count property. So our new count is going to be state.count plus action.payload, like so. So take whatever our current count is and add payload to it. Now, once again, if you decided to leave off the payload property, then you would have probably ended up with something that looks like state.count plus 1. If that's what you did, again, totally fine. So now we can handle case decrement as well. So I'll do a return .state inside of a new object, and again, count is going to be state.count. In this case, we'll do minus action.payload. Now this starts to lead us into kind of some interesting territory here, because you might have followed a similar pattern as the last component we just worked on. If you put in a payload that's like -1, and then we have minus action.payload right here, we would accidentally end up adding 1 to state.count as opposed to decreasing by 1. So you essentially need to make a decision. Either when you call case decrement, you're going to add whatever action.payload is, in which case payload would be a negative number, or alternatively, you will leave on a minus right here and say that payload is always a positive number and just describes how much we want to change our current count by. Because in this case, because we have the type property right here, I would say technically the presence of a negative sign there is implicit or kind of indicated by whether or not we've got a type of increment or decrement. In other words, you just have to go one way or another. Either you got a minus here and you're never going to have a minus inside a payload, or you've got a plus here and you're going to reflect negative values inside of a payload, one or the other. Now, the other thing I want to mention very quickly, you'll notice that we've got a ... state here. And the reason for that was that we wanted to take all the different current values out of state and throw it into this new object, and then overwrite it with this new value right here. But at present, we only have a single value inside of our state object, or a single property, and that's the count property. So technically, we're doing something like this. We're throwing, okay, throw count, whatever the current value of count is, inside this new object, and then overwrite count right away. So right now, the code that we have is kind of pointless. Nonetheless, we still follow the same pattern because at some point in time in the future, we might decide to come back and add in some additional properties to our state object, in which case we would need the ... state. So essentially what we're doing here is just future-proofing, even though it's not strictly necessary right now. All right, so I think the reducer looks good. So now we can actually call dispatch and make use of our state value from inside of our JSX. So I'm going to first find our first button right here. Whenever someone presses this button, we're going to call dispatch. We're going to pass in an action object. Because this is the increase button, I'm going to give it a type of increment. Remember, that's going to match the case that we have right here. And I'm going to add in a payload to describe how much I want to increment by. It'll be a payload of 1. And now I can do the same thing down here inside of decrease as well. So I'll do a dispatch with a type of decrement and a payload of 1 as well. And of course, if you decided to do state.count plus action.payload right here in the decrement case, then instead you would have a payload of -1. And then finally, we have to print out our current count. So inside of here, remember, we now have this state variable and inside there is a count property. And that's going to reflect what our current state is, or current count is. So down here inside of our text element, we'll do state.count. And if you decided to use a little bit of destructuring here, then you might just have count instead, which is totally fine as well. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So I'm going to save this, and we'll do a quick test. So I'm going to go back to my counter demo. I'll increase, yep, and decrease. Yep, works as well. Perfect. All right, if you had any trouble with this exercise, as usual, don't sweat it. The first time you look at all this reducer stuff, it is insanely overcomplicated. And again, when we start to make use of this reducer stuff, it's really overkill for a counter application. We usually start to see reducer stuff come in when we have some really complicated state objects. And we're definitely going to see examples of that later on inside this course. Okay, so hopefully you got this exercise put together. Let's take a quick pause right here and continue in the next video.